Greetings, friends. Welcome to the premiere of our movie, MLK 11-12-61. I'm Dr. Jamil Huck, director of the Kessel Peace Institute and an associate professor in the history department at Minnesota State University, Mankato. For the last 3 decades, the Kessel Peace Institute has promoted peace and social justice in the Mankato community and beyond. Before we begin, I want to thank all of our partners at MSU that contributed, as well as community members such as Target, Love and Struggle, and the Greater Mankato Diversity Council. I also want to thank all the interviewees in the movies, the archivists at the MSU Library, and particularly 2 students that helped with our project, Ronan Corley and Olivia Johnson, whose hard work and dedication to this project was inspiring. Today, I'm standing in the auditorium where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke 60 years ago. In many ways, Martin Luther King Jr. Day has been used as a way to avoid talking about the reality of our present and the persistence of continuing systemic racism and white supremacy in the United States. This documentary uses the historical visit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Mankato as a way to honor his anti-racist activism, as well as to point out that this work remains incomplete and must continue. Just as a note to our viewers, to younger viewers, this documentary does have some depictions of historical violence. Now I will turn the camera over to my friend, Dr. Matt Loiza, Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Minnesota State University, Mankato.
Thank you, Jamil. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, let me join Dr. Huck in thanking you all for joining us today. In addition to thanking our community partners that Jamil just mentioned, I'd like to express my gratitude to all of those at Minnesota State University Mankato that have helped make this project a reality. Those include the Office of African American Affairs, the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, College of Arts and Humanities, College of Education, the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Department of History, Department of Communication Studies, and Memorial Library. Special thanks as well go to our SBS Communications and Events Director, Elise Anderson, and to Brian Johnson, our IT Solutions Architect. That's our in-house term for our resident miracle worker. Finally, I'd like to thank both Jamil Huck and Ryan Sturgis for the creative energy, the professionalism, and the commitment to social justice that they've brought to this project. As we reflect on Dr. King's 1961 visit to Mankato, let's remember that Dr. King came to Mankato not to reassure us that everything would work out in the end given enough time, but rather to alert us to the urgency of changing the existing status quo that denied African Americans their fundamental civil rights, including the right to vote. Recent challenges to civil rights should prompt and voting rights should prompt us to heed Dr. King's call for us to be activists rather than just bystanders in the work to make our world a better place for everyone. Accordingly, let's honor Dr. King and mark this occasion not as a time to celebrate, but rather as a day of reflection and a call to action. So once again, thank you all for joining us. And without further ado, I'll turn the camera over to the Superintendent of the Mankato Area Public Schools, Dr. Paul Peterson.
Thank you, Matt. Greetings, everyone. And on behalf of Mankato Area Public Schools, welcome and thank you for participating in this important community event commemorating Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to Mankato in 1961. My name is Paul Peterson, proud superintendent for Mankato Schools, and it is a tremendous pleasure to be here at West High School, where Dr. King spoke now 60 years ago. The fact that he came to what was then Mankato High School to speak about the challenges of the times and his hopes for a brighter day reinforced his views that the youth of America can make a positive difference in our collective future. And now, 60 years later, this remains true. In 2021, Mankato Schools recommitted itself to working together equitably with families and communities so that each learner has the knowledge and skills to be successful and contributing citizens in a diverse global society. This work takes all of us. And as the largest pre-K-12 school system in our region, Mankato Schools is proud to be doing its part to accelerate community-wide values, such as equity, inclusion, and togetherness. A special thank you to Dr. Jamil Huck and Mr. Matt Moore, and all those who have worked together to bring this project to our community today. And now it's my pleasure to reintroduce you to the director of the Kessel Peace Institute, Dr. Jamil Huck. Jamil.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's now time for the main event, the premiere of the MLK 11/12/61 movie. Just bear with me for a second, and we will launch.
So I want to turn your attention to this subject, loving your enemies. It is part of my basic philosophical and theological orientation, the whole idea of love, the whole philosophy of love. Love is understanding, redemptive goodwill for all men, so that you love everybody because God loves them. You refuse to do anything that will defeat an individual, because you have agape in your soul. Because hate destroys the hater as well as the hated.
MLK is the preeminent figure of the civil rights movement.
I believe he was one of the more seminal voices, not only as an orator, but as a writer and a thinker that the 20th century produced.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led a movement that would redefine the idea of freedom in America. His words inspired millions to take action against structural hypocrisy, institutional discrimination, and individual cruelty.
Don't allow anybody to cause you to lose your self-respect to the point that you do not struggle for justice.
He forced his way into the homes and hearts of those simply blind to injustice.
It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people.
And prove to a nation that discrimination against American citizens for the color of their skin was ungodly, unjust, and unacceptable.
With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope.
He had a certain ability and flexibility, and I would say even bandwidth, as we use now, to understand what I'm going to call the connective tissue to other human beings.
Though Dr. King worked with thousands from all ages, ethnicities, and economic backgrounds to achieve his successes, it was his voice that reached the ears of the nation.
He was trying to inspire a nation forward, but I think he also inspired individuals to be more active in moving that nation forward.
I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be.
Admired or hated, beloved and despised, his nonviolent direct action approach laid the foundation for progress towards true equality in a country that prides itself on individual liberty.
Even though we might have different perceptions of that vision, his vision of progress resonates with everyone.
His empathy, strength, resilience, and love fueled movements that led to the desegregation of Southern buses, lunch counters, and schools. His philosophy inspired the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, shaped the Federal Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But before his brutal and senseless assassination in 1968, before Selma's Bloody Sunday in 1965, before the Voting Act and Civil Rights Bill, and before his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, on November 12, 1961, Dr. Martin Luther King visited a small white community in the Midwest, and by sharing his dream of equity, changed Mankato, Minnesota's perception of race forever. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. The second of three children, his parents, Martin and Alberta King, raised their family in a quaint but comfortable home on Sweet Auburn Avenue, a vibrant black community in Atlanta, known to some who lived there during the era of segregation as the richest Negro street in the world.
Of course, Atlanta was a segregated community at the time, so Auburn Avenue was one of the few places in the city where African Americans could go to find a restaurant where they could be served or shopping where they would be treated fairly. There was a jazz club, schools, there was a business college on Auburn Avenue for African American students. Dr. King's father was the preacher at the Ebenezer Baptist Church on Auburn Avenue.
And this is at a time where there was not many middle class or upper class jobs that were available to black men and black women in the South. So being a minister was one of the few ways that a black man in this instance could make a decent living.
Growing up in the church, first pastored by his maternal grandfather, Adam Daniel Williams, then by his father, Martin Luther King Sr., young Martin developed a deep connection to preaching, and although he grappled at times with his father's expectations to follow in his footsteps, Martin was ordained a minister by the very same church at just 18 years of age. Martin soared through school, skipping both the 9th and 12th grades, and in addition to his studies, was heavily involved with his high school debate team, where he was able to exercise his early devotion to social justice. His very first public speech, given as a junior in high school, stated, quote, "Black America still wears chains. The finest Negro is at the mercy of the meanest white man."
He came from that tradition in the church in the South, in Georgia particularly, but his why was motivated by what he saw his father endure. You know, the racism and the discrimination, and his father not having the ability to speak up against that because of the threat of lynching, and so he saw a lot of that in his childhood.
Graduating at 19 with a degree in sociology from Morehouse College, King immediately attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he was student body president and delivered the valedictory address. A year later, while studying for his doctorate in theology at Boston University, Martin met Coretta Scott. Two Southerners in the Northeast, they found they had much in common, and within a year, they were married. Setting aside ambitions for a career in music, Coretta Scott King followed her husband to Montgomery, Alabama, where, at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would begin a timeless career as a minister for justice.
I put the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on it because I think there's something in terms of cultural understandings that's important about that. In some circles, the preacher side of him gets left off of who he was. But in black circles, it's a very fundamental and elemental part about who he was, because what that did, in my mind, was serve in a way to feed people's souls when they needed it. Sometimes, you know, civil rights alone was not enough to address sort of the pains, and sometimes people needed that tie into something greater.
A little over a year after he arrived in Montgomery, Rosa Parks made her very famous stand on a local city bus, refusing to stand up according to the dictates of the segregation law in the city to give her seat over to a white man.
Despite contemporary depictions of Rosa Parks as a passive seamstress, she was in fact, at the time of her arrest, already extremely active in the fight for racial justice and served as the secretary of the local chapter of the NAACP, and was also well connected to other civil rights groups like the Women's Political Council.
There was already an active civil rights movement in Montgomery, and it was headed largely by black women.
The moment they heard of Parks' arrest, the Women's Political Council began circulating flyers to black bus riders across the city for a single-day boycott of the Montgomery bus system.
The local NAACP chapter started helping get attention to the boycott, and one of the ways they did that was by contacting the local black preachers in the community. And of course, Dr. King was one of the preachers that was contacted.
Though initially trepidatious about taking a leadership role in the boycott, Dr. King found the cause too important to ignore, and after seeing the remarkable success from day one of what would become a year-long movement, he heeded the call of his peers to become the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and the course of his professional and personal life shifted from that of a preacher of a church to the leader of a movement.
Negroes in Montgomery and so many other areas have been inflicted with the paralysis of crippling fear on buses in our community. So many occasions, Negroes have been intimidated and humiliated because of the sheer fact that they were Negroes. You know, my friends, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression.
He was 26 years old. I mean, they're looking for somebody to not only take over the leadership of the church, but to serve in a more national effort for civil rights. They all said, yeah, who's going to be the leader? And it's like, well, Martin. Because this dude, his oratory skills and his acumen for learning and absorbing, and it's got to be him.
King's capabilities at the podium were certainly an asset to the movement in Montgomery, and his personal commitment to the cause was tireless. However, there were other aspects of his standing in the community that were particularly advantageous to the boycott.
Why did he become the spokesperson in Montgomery? Because he was young, he was brand new to town, he's a minister at an all-black church, his salary is paid for by an all-black constituency, and so he doesn't owe any money to any white people, and no white person can get him fired. So all of the usual tactics that the massive resistance movement would usually use to intimidate people who launched civil rights movements, they couldn't really use against King. They couldn't get him fired. They couldn't get him evicted from his house. They couldn't cancel any of his insurance policies. So therefore, he becomes the spokesperson.
It was through his participation with the Montgomery bus boycott that he was able to become both the face and the voice of the civil rights movement.
The Montgomery bus boycott was a resounding success. After months of organized resistance, on June 5, 1956, the Montgomery Federal Court ruled that any law requiring the racial segregation of riders on a city bus violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Though the city appealed the ruling, on December 20, 1956, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the lower court's decision, and after 381 days, the boycott came to an end. But for Dr. Martin Luther King, for his career, for his legacy, the Montgomery bus boycott marked only the beginning.
So they formed a new organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC for short. And during these early years of the movement, he spent a lot of time traveling to places to speak based on invitations, just like he did here in Mankato.
He'll write a book after the Montgomery bus boycott comes to a conclusion. He'll go on a speaking tour to promote the book, and this is about the time that the Wesley Foundation at MSU will reach out to him and ask him to be a speaker here in Mankato.
My name is Sally Burdick, and I was privileged to attend a sermon by Dr. Martin Luther King in the fall of 1961 when I was 19 years old. And I'm almost 80 now, so that was a long time ago.
It was brought to our attention as a university community, hey, he was in Mankato. It was kind of a surprise.
Stephen Burns is my name. I saw Martin Luther King on November 12th of 1961 at Mankato High School at that point, and an unforgettable day.
It's November of 1961, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech right here on the stage.
I have certainly spent some rewarding moments here in Mankato, and I hope that circumstances will make it possible for me to return again.
Dr. King was in Mankato?
I think you'll find a lot of people who were quite surprised that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came here in the 60s.
We were told that there was a young Baptist pastor who was coming, who was a very charismatic speaker. We knew we were going to see something special, but we didn't know exactly because this was kind of at the beginning, and I didn't know much about him.
What Martin Luther King Jr. is embarking upon here is kind of a long mission to get the Midwest, the North, to care about this movement that's primarily, at this time in 1961, primarily happening in the South.
It says a ton about his willingness to go wherever the message had to go.
The Wesley Foundation that recruited him to come here, I think we're definitely part of that vision.
I think it's important that to note that the energy he had to fly to all these places. He was so passionate about his cause, and we should all be passionate about our cause as long as it's a positive one.
Shows the mobility of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the means by which he wanted to articulate that view of social justice.
60 years ago, in what was a much smaller, almost entirely white community in 1961, there were people who were interested in hearing what Dr. King had to say about these issues.
Dr. King's journey to Mankato began with a letter written by Reverend Wilbur D. Gross from the Centenary Methodist Church and Wesley Foundation at Mankato State College on March 25, 1959. Gross, having heard King present at the Minnesota Pastors Conference a few years prior, invited him to be the inaugural speaker for a lectureship designed to, quote, enable our students and others to clarify their thinking regarding some of the essential elements of Christian faith as they relate to the crucial problems of our day.
He came to Mankato because he was invited. They didn't have to invite him. He wouldn't have came, probably, if he was not invited.
On April 10, 1959, Dr. King returned Gross's letter, thanking him sincerely for the invitation, but regrettably declining due to scheduling issues. However, Gross and the Wesley Foundation, knowing full well the value of Dr. King's insights on issues of civil rights, did not give up so easily. In April, Gross invited King to speak for the second annual event in November of 1960, which he again had to decline. So in November, Gross tried for a third time, and finally, King agreed to come and speak for the third annual lectureship in November of 1961. He was offered $250 plus travel expenses.
And so he was invited and he came and he helped people see the issues.
Throughout the fall semester of 1961, Reverend Gross and the Wesley Foundation eagerly anticipated Dr. King's arrival, and so did many residents of the primarily rural white farming community of Mankato.
The minister from Centenary was the first one I heard it from when he came over and said with great excitement that this was going to happen.
It's important for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to have his message resonate with white folk, especially during that time.
Many of us had come from communities where we had never experienced any diversity.
Although most of the members of this community had little to no experience with diversity in culture or race, news of King's arrival excited many open-hearted residents, eager to learn more about the issues he had been so passionately and elegantly presenting on the national stage.
In a lot of ways, his message allows white folk to be reflective about who they are in terms of, of course, their own personal understanding of race, but also understanding their own position in being white and what that might mean.
His effort and then his dedication was just kind of the start of that whole movement, a good nonviolent movement. That was really in the early years of a very significant era.
Many knew in their hearts the importance of inviting King's perspective into their community, and when he finally arrived on November 12, 1961, the Christian and academic communities of Mankato, Minnesota, received him with great affection.
The thing that I tell people, and I do tell a lot of people about it, and they're pretty amazed, the thing that just struck me was the fact that he had a bodyguard on each side of him during the entire appearance.
Though many supported and were open to Dr. King's message in Mankato, radical and violent hatred towards Black Americans in 1961 was not exclusive to Southern states. By this time in King's career, his life had been threatened numerous times by racists from all across the country, and he had learned to prepare himself for the worst, hope for the best, and never let his guard down.
He was a man who was willing to go to hostile territory, and I'm saying that intentionally. When he came here, I'm pretty sure he read, okay, this is the place where they hung 38 Dakota elders. So he's going into hostile territory, and also I'm pretty sure he knew the demographics of Minnesota. What's instructive to me is that, this is what I mean by bandwidth. What a brave thing to do.
I'm gonna tell you right now, being black in this country and traveling roads to get to Mankato in 1961, I can't imagine that.
Today, anybody in the movement on any, and I'd say the color spectrum all the way across, right? Anybody that's involved with trying to think about, progress for us as a community needs to consider how brave that was and maybe learn some lessons. The lesson is sometimes you got to be brave.
At 8:23 a.m. on Sunday, November 12th, Dr. Martin Luther King landed at the Mankato Airport. He would give 2 sermons at the Centenary Methodist Church that morning, a lecture open to the public at Mankato High School that afternoon, and leave at 11 p.m. from Minneapolis to go on to his next engagement. For all his speeches, it was standing room only, and there were hundreds of additional hopeful attendees lined up outside the door in the cold November air to see him.
I was privileged to be in the middle section, probably, I think we were about 5 or 6 rows back, so we were pretty close. And it was packed. Every seat was taken, and they had brought in chairs, and there were people standing. And I think people were turned away.
Mankato in that time was in the right place and invited a man like him here and embraced him and supported him.
He spoke on the good neighbor and how it's important for us to help others and be good neighbors and to respect other people's differences, and pointing out to this almost completely white audience that he had about the importance of being a good neighbor to all people.
Articulating a message of social justice was so essential to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to have him here in Mankato. That's an important moment for the Mankato community.
I am certainly delighted to have the privilege of being in your community today and to discuss with you one of the vital issues of our day.
I think it was Sunday afternoon, I believe, about 3 o'clock was when Dr. King was at the Mankato High School. I don't think there was an empty seat. It was just a real full, we were in the lower level, and I remember there was a balcony, and that seemed to be full up there.
Now, whenever anything new comes into history, it brings with it new challenges and new responsibilities.
Martin Luther King Jr. lays out in his speech 3 challenges. He calls them challenges for the new age.
So I would like to mention some of the challenges that we face as a result of this emerging new age.
They were relevant in 1961, and they're still relevant today.
First, we are challenged to develop a world perspective.
He talks about the challenge of recognizing that you live in an interconnected world.
We must rise above the narrow confines of our individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. Modern man has been able to dwarf distance and place time in change. And our jet planes have compressed into minutes distances that once took days. I think Bob Hope has adequately described this new jet age in which we live, and I know it isn't the usual thing for a preacher to be quoting Bob Hope, but I think he has adequately described this new jet age. He said it is an age in which it is possible to take a non-stop flight from Los Angeles, California to New York City. And if on taking off in Los Angeles you develop hiccups, you will hitch in Los Angeles and cup in New York City.
He started off his speech by telling a joke, and I remember the punchline, but I don't remember the details. But maybe the recording has it. Punchline was, "I got there tomorrow," and it had to do with airplane schedules.
You know, it is possible because of the time difference to take a flight from Tokyo, Japan on Sunday morning and arrive in Seattle, Washington on the preceding Saturday night. And when your friends meet you at the airport and ask when you left Tokyo, you will have to say, "I left tomorrow." This is the kind of world in which we live. Now, this is a bit humorous, but I'm trying to laugh a basic fact into all of us, and it is simply this, that the world in which we live is geographically one. The world in which we live is a neighborhood. And now more than ever before, we are challenged to make this world a brotherhood. We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools.
Second challenge is confronting white supremacy head on.
We must get rid of the notion once and for all that there are superior and inferior races. They would say that if you integrate schools and if you integrate other facilities, the Negro will pull the white race back a generation. Or the Negro is not culturally ready for integration. And then they will go on to say, you know, the Negro is a criminal. And because of these things, we just can't have integration without bringing about social corruption and social dislocation and everything else.
We didn't know we were in the presence of greatness at that time.
He wanted to engage every single person in every chair. He was just a commanding personality.
Now the people who argue on the basis of this fail to say that if there are lagging standards within the Negro community, they lag because of segregation and discrimination. They fail to say poverty, ignorance, and disease breed crime, whatever the racial group may be. These things are environmental and not racial. And it is a tortuous logic to use the tragic results of segregation as an argument for the continuation of it. So we must get rid of the notion once and for all that there are superior and inferior races.
Super big issue in 1961, still a big issue today. The last challenge he issues is to engage in creative protest.
We are challenged to continue to engage in creative protest in order to bring an end to the barriers of racial segregation and discrimination. All over this nation, we must develop men and women who will not rest till segregation and discrimination have been removed from every area of our nation's life.
I think because of the type of group it was, very open-minded, generally quite liberal. Most of them were very, very open to it.
I distinctly remember that people were very respectful.
There is need for nonviolent direct action. I am still convinced that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. Now, there are many advantages to this method. It has certain practical advantages, has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses. It weakens his morale, and at the same time, it works on his conscience. It says that the individuals involved can secure moral ends through moral means. This method has been used in a marvelous way by hundreds and thousands of Negro students over the South in the magnificent Freedom Rides. As a result of the Freedom Rides, something has happened, never happened before. Most of the cities in the Deep South now have integrated bus terminals. And I am convinced that the ICC ruling, which took effect on the 1st of November, declaring all segregation in interstate travel as far as bus transportation is concerned illegal. I'm convinced that this ruling came into being directly as a result of the Freedom Ride. So this way of nonviolent direct action is a powerful approach for social change.
In 1961, you had the Freedom Rides kind of wrapping up by the time he's giving this speech, but that was a really creative form of protest happening then. You know, what we need to see today is still people engaging in creative forms of protest.
The things that stick out to me most are his charisma, the strength of his voice, and the way that he was able to hold his audience, and the fact that I was one of the people that got to shake his hand afterwards. He looked right in my eye, thanked me for coming, and I felt like I was the only person there at that moment. And I remember that. That image is still with me.
I'll never forget that day. I'll never forget that experience, especially in light of what's happened in our history in the last 60 years now. And I'm sure glad I got to be there, and I think it's part of a real positive movement in this country.
Dr. King's words were educational for some, moving for others, and transformative for most who had the privilege of hearing them in person. The community of Mankato was offered a perspective they simply hadn't had access to until that day, and it would shape their views not only on race and civil liberty, but on humanity and a seed for the concept of equality, true equality, for every living person was planted in their hearts.
There are some clear takeaways you can learn from the civil rights movement, and you can apply these lessons to today, so that if you see injustice happening in your community, you can kind of take these ideas from the civil rights movement and apply them to the present.
If we look at protests in our day, if it's protests around Black Lives Matter, some of the things that we're using are the same techniques he used, right? We're going to show up en masse. We're going to march.
King also understood there was a need to understand this struggle from a political context, an activist one, a spiritual one, and a global citizenry one. I think those things were really unique about his approach.
We have to choose the accurate version of his I Have a Dream. The inaccurate version has been based off of the line, I want my kids to be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And we took from that race didn't matter. Let's be colorblind. It was the exact opposite. He was condemning a nation that only saw the color of his kid's skin. And so I think as we talk about the work that we have to do going forward, it has to be, what is that accurate I Have a Dream speech? I do believe that's part of our responsibility, not only here in Mankato, right, greater Mankato, but across this country, right, is to really look at that speech, right, and to really do that work that he talked about.
When we see the numerous instances of police brutality, when we see the inequities in housing, and we see the inequities in unemployment rates, when we see incarceration rates, when we see those various disparities in statistics and data, there's still a lot of work to do.
I always add on, we have much work to do. And in particular for us as a nation when it comes to matters on race. Race has been unfortunately, right, a defining feature of our country, unlike any other place in the world.
If you look at history, people in the majority have not always treated people in the minority well. And so I got to imagine some of these people saying, I know how those people were treated in the minority. What will it mean if I'm in the minority? How do you have a conversation with somebody who is afraid?
That's the thing that we need to get over, is sort of this fear of loss of power and privilege, and understand that it's really about making the state just better for everyone. This is how we'll actually move Minnesota ahead and stop being at the top of the list for some of these disparities that we're seeing in education and criminal justice and healthcare and economics and housing.
I think we as a community have to acknowledge that not at every moment of our community's history were we including everyone. And that's a tough thing for folks to do. When a community has operated as it has for how many ever years, not having to think about race, and then all of a sudden you're at this moment where you do, and you have to change systems and structures, that's difficult, disruptive work. And what I found is that there's a critical mass of folks here who are willing to do that difficult and disruptive work.
It's easy to forget the past. What's the old saying? You're destined to repeat the past if you forget it.
Our past is always commingling with our present and future. So thematically, like he was here, right? And now look at what's going on. Even in Mankato, what would happen if he were to be here now?
It's actually really important to look back at why he came, what was happening then, what he said, what kind of message he left, and think about how that can be applied now.
The need for him to come then is still with us.
And I think that there's enough people here that are interested in doing the work and that are already doing the work that it's not going to be an easy lift, but there are some people that are ready to do that lifting and are already trying to do some of that.
I choose to stay in Mankato, and part of that is I truly feel like we have folks who are willing to sort of grow and learn. In particular, as we talk about race relations, inclusion.
One of the things that I have found so special about Mankato since I've been here is the active social justice community.
You see various schools and various institutions actually trying to figure out ways to make change, trying to figure out ways to articulate and focus on social justice.
I've been really fortunate to lead the Martin Luther King commemorative event that happens each year. We were one of the first communities to celebrate and honor him here in the state of Minnesota, in particular even before the federal holiday. Each year, reminding our community about his legacy and how we continue to live that out.
I was part of the group that worked to get Martin Luther King Boulevard to happen many years ago, to recognize and being here.
This is a meaningful event for us to not only celebrate, but also reflect on some of the difficulties and struggles of those individuals who do live in this community.
I think it's important to think about his work and think about what sort of community, what sort of city Mankato really wants to be, and what things need to change in order to create that, because it certainly could happen here.
From an Africana studies framework and a Black studies framework, there's a thing that we use called remembering. It is remembering, wait a minute, oh, this is not the first time that this problem that we have is going on right now happened. Let's go back and see and remember how they addressed it then. What can we learn from, right? What can we do differently, or what can we do the same?
So I would love to see that we continue every year to look at those three areas that Martin Luther King Jr. challenged the Mankato audience on. To recognize that we live in an interconnected world, to recognize that white supremacy is a dangerous thing, to recognize that we need to engage in creative forms of protest, and to have community dialogues about those things.
The mandate I get from him being here is that we are duty-bound as Mankatoans to play our part. We must do something to make our community more inclusive, more equitable. He could have been a lot of places. He chose this to be one of those places.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the movie. Please stay with us while we have a panel discussion with some of the participants of the movie. Our panel today will be hosted by Bukata Hayes. Bukata, do you have access to the Q&A section?
Yes, I do.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to hand it over to you. Ryan and I are also going to be joining us. Ryan Sturgis is our director of the movie here today. If all the panelists could turn their videos on, and welcome everybody. I'm so glad to have you all. Thank you, Bukata.
All right, thank you. So want to welcome everyone. Want to give my thanks to Jamil and Ryan and his team for a really powerful reminder of Dr. King's visit to our community, and then the encouragement I think that leaves for us. And so I want to welcome our panel. I have joining us today Dr. Henry Morris, who is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at MSU Mankato. We have Matt Moore, who is a social studies teacher at Mankato West High School. We have Stacy Wells, Director of Communication for the Mankato Area Public Schools. We have Gio Cooley, who's the Associate Professor, History Department at MSU Mankato. And then we have Dr. Christopher Brown, Acting Dean of the College of Arts and Humanity at MSU Mankato. And so I think what I want to do is simply open it up, give you sort of your quick reaction to the film, about a minute or 90 seconds each, and then we'll get into some questions that from the film I think we should answer, we should address as a community. So I'll start with Matt. Just some of your thoughts, opening comments for our panel today.
Yeah, I thought the film was great. I was
I have a 6-year-old daughter, and I was telling her that I was going to be in this movie, and so she thinks I'm like the coolest guy on earth right now, that I got to be in a movie. So, but yeah, this is like by far and away one of the coolest things I've been able to be a part of in my career. So I definitely want to thank Jamil and Ryan for all the work they did on putting this together. I've been teaching at Mankato West since 2011, and when I started here, I didn't know that Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech in our building. And I found out after working with some of the librarians at MSU. And I think it's pretty common for kids to come through West and for people to work at West without knowing that. And I think now that we have this film, we have a mural in our auditorium now that you saw, and we're going to add a historical marker outside of the building too. And so I think it's going to be pretty rare going forward that there will be a student who comes through Mankato West who won't know that like Mankato hosted Martin Luther King Jr. So I think this film really it provides a nice tool for our community to use to enhance that education.
All right, thank you, Matt. We'll go to Dr. Morris. Some of your opening comments and reactions to the documentary.
Good morning, everybody. And again, my congratulations to the producer and the director of this documentary. One of my goals every day is to learn something new, whether it's small or new. And I learned quite a bit from this documentary. So I feel very blessed today, and I feel very special today because I learned, as I said, more than one thing today because of this documentary about his visit, about the man, and about his visit to Mankato.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Morris. I'll go to Stacy.
Well, first, just really acknowledging Jamil and Ryan. What a great documentary. The way it was put together, I really appreciate sort of the chronological timeline and then connecting it back to what's happening now and sort of how we need to move forward. So really great film. It was really cool to see and hear from people that actually were there and experienced it, and to hear some of that history. So thank you.
Dr. Brown.
Yeah, I want to echo the sentiments of everyone who just spoke. I mean, great work, Ryan and Jamil. This is so wonderful, especially for our community. I think it's very important. It's a very important piece of history. And, we should probably do more to commemorate the day that he came, November 12th, 1961. Great job. Very powerful piece of history and very important piece of history that everyone can really galvanize around.
Thank you. And Jill.
Yes, I'll just echo the sentiments of everyone else in how well done I thought the film was. And I encouraged my students to watch, so I hope I have some students that are still on the panel just listening to the panel discussion now. But I think it's really important. Sometimes we learn about US history and we learn about civil rights, and it seems like something that's so far away, both in time, but also in space, and especially something like the civil rights movement, where in the 1950s and 60s, the most well-known events, at least, are happening in the South. And to take that history and to make it really relevant, and something that was also happening here, and to see how Dr. King spoke to not just his generation across the US, but was also able to find ideas that really spoke to the people here in Mankato at that time is, I think, a really important effort.
Wonderful. So I see that we do have two questions, comments already in the Q&A. I did just want to start off, and this goes to all of the panelists, including Jamil and Ryan, if you wanted to weigh in on this too. And so the question I had is, as we think back to that day, and MLK being in Mankato, and if he were to come back today, right? He'd been 93, right, this year. If he were to come back today, what would he say about our progress? And what would he point to as proof of our progress here in Mankato? So again, if he was to hear today, What would he say about our progress as a community? And what might be some things he would point to as proof of that progress? And so what I'll do is I'll open it up to if there's someone who would like to respond first, or else I can simply call on someone to start. Is anybody who would like to respond first?
Hey, Bukata, Jamil, and Ryan here. We'll jump in here real quick to answer this very easy question of yours. And thank you so much for hosting the panel. And I also want to acknowledge that KMSU, the radio station at Minnesota State University Mankato, they preserved that speech for us, and that's the only reason we have any audio or visuals from that day. And that's all we actually have. As for that question, I know, so Ryan and I conducted interviews with all of you, and this was one of the questions we asked and one of the topics of discussion that came up often. And I'm going to really cede the floor to the interviewees and put the pressure on them. Ryan, do you have anything to add to this as well?
I think it's a really important question, and I think we were really fortunate. First thing I want to say that there is no film without all of you who are here in the panel, and several others as well. And we're so grateful to your insights, expertise, and just being willing to contribute your knowledge and care to the subject. It was built on. The story is built on the recording and everything that you shared. So thank you very much for contributing. But I think it's an amazing question. And I think we were really fortunate to have that theme arise in our film, because what good is knowing history if we aren't going to use it, right? And so, I think there's two sides to that, to answer that question. One is he'll see some points of progress, right, in our community that seem significant because we have a more diverse group of people. In Mankato, we've got a more diverse leadership group of people in Mankato. There are people in positions throughout the university, that weren't in those positions when he was here 60 years ago. Those are all really important points of progress. And, he would see other points of progress around town throughout our community that are really incredible things that have happened since he started his work. But then that are also, in some ways, more of a window dressing way of looking at progress. And I think that there is a lot he would see in our structure, in our system, that I'm not sure, that he would be as proud of, right? And so I think that while we have come a long way in 60 years with the way that our community moves forward and runs our lives, our own lives in our world, and that has become far more diverse. But there are also many things that, as we hear about in the film, that we've got to work on. And so I think he'd be really good at helping us figure out how, to get the rest of the way, right? We're part of the way there. And I think the thing for me, learning so much about Martin Luther King throughout this project, the thing for me that I took away the most of is his tireless attempt at working on these things. And the way that he did that, I think is beautiful and difficult. The whole idea of nonviolence is a very difficult thing. And I think but I also believe it to be very important. And I think that we can do much more in our community and take a lot from what he has brought to us 60 years ago and use it today.
Very good. Thank you, Ryan. Absolutely. So I probably should have known who one of the folks I could have started with too, and that's somebody who's been in our community and sort of witnessed some things for a long time through his work at the university. And so I'll ask Dr. Morris, how would he, in essence, sort of, what would he see about our progress, and what things could he point to as proof?
You know, I gave another speech this morning at Bemidji State on as a part of Martin Luther King Day, and sort of like the same kind of question. And, you know, I must admit, I think he would be sad. I think he would be sad about the digression of relationships, voting rights in the nation in the last 4 years. You know, the Supreme Court has moved from a bastion of civil rights champions to gutting the Voting Rights Act. You know, we got 1920 states that have re-implemented ways to keep people from voting. And it isn't people white, it's to keep people that look like us from voting. So I think he would be sad. I think he would think a lot of the work that he has done has gone backwards. Are we do we have more people of color in Minnesota? Mankato, yeah. When I got here, I think the school district is about 1% people of color. It is now, I think, well over 20% of the students in K-12. The universities is much diverse. But I think he would also tell us to re-energize ourselves, because we got to get back to the streets. We got to get back to protests. We got to get back to letting people know that this is not acceptable, no matter where it's at. And so I think he would be a little sad about if he was still alive today.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. Stacey, I see that you unmuted.
Just quickly, I wanted to follow up on what Dr. Morris was saying. Two things, really. There have certainly been some things that have shown some progress, but whether they've been really changed lives of the people who are most oppressed, that is really only a question that they can answer. And I think far too often we try to answer that question, and white folks in particular try to answer that question for those folks in those communities. And we can't do that, because I think that they would offer the most honest critique, positive or negative, right? And so we have to be cautious when we do that, because the things that we see or the things that people maybe have been in Mankato a long time see, while they may not be, they're not bad and they may show some progress, what is the real impact of those things on people's everyday lives, I think is something we need to keep in mind.
Very good. Others, Matt, Dr. Brown, Jill, any thoughts?
I would just, I guess, echo what I said in the film about the social justice community here in Mankato. And you have organizations within the community that are actively doing social justice work, and also at the university, and organizations like the Kessel Peace Institute. And then you have teachers like Matt Moore, and teachers at the university who are working with their students to make sure that they can learn this history, which is often not necessarily taught as accurately as it could be in terms of the real focus of civil rights back in the 1950s and 60s, and that continuing movement. We often think the civil rights movement stopped in 1965, and of course that's not true. So I think just the network of people who are really working toward telling the story and the history of civil rights and doing that work today here in Mankato, I see as a positive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone is saying here. Especially, yes, he would take the snapshot look, and I guess looking at the visual dynamics and see that progress. There's certainly been areas of progress that have been initiated or throughout the city. But then again, I'm sure he will challenge us to rethink how we understand that narrative of progress as it relates to the Mankato community. I think he would challenge us to actually challenge how progress is seen and how it's viewed and how it's understood, in spite of the visual identity politics of Black leadership or people of color in leadership positions across the city.
Yeah, very good. Matt, anything to add before we move on? to the next question.
Yeah, I would just add that I think one of the things that I guess I try to remind my students of with Martin Luther King, he's a pretty complex figure, and that by the tail end of his life, he gets assassinated in 1968, and he kind of disappears from our collective memory. History textbooks kind of forget about him after 1965, and so that's the Selma campaign, that's the Voting Rights Act. But after 1965, like he begins to push in a much more radical direction. Like he's making people, especially white audiences, especially northern white audiences, like more and more uncomfortable. And you can see that if you check out any of the public opinion surveying that was done at the time, like his favorability rating like continues to go down as you go further and further into the 1960s. And what he's doing is like, so early in the 1960s, he was addressing social issues like segregation, political issues like voting rights. And then after the Voting Rights Act, he really starts to push heavy on economic issues like housing. He moves his family up to Chicago. They launch a Chicago campaign to try to talk about housing discrimination that's happening in Chicago. One of the last sermons he gives before he's assassinated, he's talking about reparations. So I think that whatever his topic would be, he would probably be doing something to make the audience a little bit uncomfortable, because I think that was something he was doing a lot more of by the time you get into the tail end of his life there in 1968.
Yeah, it segues really well into, sorry about that. That was my New Year's resolution too, is to never be on mute when I was supposed to be talking, and I just failed already. But what you said, Matt, and others, I think segues really well into two comments we have in the question and answer. And it's around sort of using MLK quotes, right, to sort of buttress racism, in particular, racist acts or racist policies. And in particular, one person mentions the sort of anti-critical race theory, right, that we know we as a nation are embedded in, but involved in, but in particular, we see our school districts and our higher ed institutions being bombarded with accusations around CRT. And so one person asks, what advice would you offer to constructively respond to people who try to use the words of MLK, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to support their own racism? And then another simply said, like, what do we do as folks in some ways misattribute, right? I think we can say that pretty accurately, misattribute the words of Dr. King and his encouragements to, in essence, again, support racist ideas or policies. So I'll open it up to the panel.
I want to jump on this one fast. Sorry, I feel kind of strongly. Sometimes you laugh at fools and you don't honor them by giving them an answer or trying to deconstruct their stupidity. Because no matter what you say, I have doubts whether they're going to change their point of view. So why engage with idiots? And so, I think laughter is a strong weapon. Just laugh and say, okay, and move on. And have those conversations with people who truly do understand what he was saying and others were saying at that time.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Morris. Others, how do you respond? What advice would you give as folks are sort of misusing Dr. King's quotes and message?
As I talked a little bit about in the video, we all have a vision of progress, right? But some of us, we all see this vision of progress in very unique ways. I would say that we have this linear perception that progress is moving in one direction, but some of us understand that progress is more complicated. And used as Dr. King's words are often used to justify progress, right? Racial progress. But progress is much more complicated. It's complex and it's contingent, and sometimes it's irreversible. And so I think we have to, as we see a more open embrace of racism, there's still institutionalized discrimination. There's still social inequalities that are prevalent. I think we have to think deeply about these, as if we, as individuals, tend to use Dr. King's words
to justify this narrative of progress. There are a lot of there's some issues. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed before we can even really think about or progress in the way that people are thinking about progress, as we have already overcome.
Yeah, very good. Others, it's very prevalent today. Matter of fact, right? If you go on Twitter, Facebook, social media, you will see politicians, news folks, personalities, I'll say it this way, who for 364 days are advocating against such things as the Voting Rights Act, right? The reauthorization of that, or else discriminatory policies, right? Some people mention anti-CRT. And then today, right, we'll use quotes from Dr. King, in some ways given the sense that they're championing, right, inclusion and equity, or else use one of Dr. King's quotes to speak towards why we should have or not have inclusion or equity. That somehow, I'll use this term, that it is sort of reverse racism, right? To be moving towards more equitable policies and doing what we have to do that. So any other sort of encouragement, advice, thoughts about how to respond to folks misusing MLK quotes, not only today, but throughout the year?
I think you can often tell if someone really has studied his work because they only really go back to one or two quotes, right? And even in those, they don't use them in the complete context or misuse them to make their point. But to Matt's point, there was, I mean, you know, Dr. King has a whole canon of literature, and his work is deep and it's complicated and it changes over time. But if you read it and study it, you would not misinterpret what he was trying to say. And so that is one of the things I always think about for those that are, you know, not the ones that Dr. Morris spoke to, but those that are actually really interested in learning a bit more, just encouraging them to read something from him and not to take other people's interpretation of his words, but actually go back to his words, which we could do. There's a lot of ways to do that. And so that's one of the things that I always suggest. I mean, I know that I have more to learn about his work, so I think everybody could do that. I think that's one thing that we can do, and just understand that his views changed over time. And part of that was because of what he experienced trying to do the work, right? And how he was not necessarily always beloved, or even sort of the animus that much of society tries to create between him and other figures such as Malcolm X, for example, or others, trying to paint them as two entirely different the way that what they were trying to accomplish was so entirely different. And in fact, it wasn't, especially near the end. So there's a lot to learn. And I would just encourage people to continue learning. Reading is fundamental, as they say.
So thanks. Yeah, great. So, okay. Yeah, Jill. And then I do know that there's some questions about who invited Dr. King, a little bit more about sort of the reason for that. So we'll get to that to Jamil and Ryan after Jill's comment.
I was just going to expand on what Stacy was saying. You know, in the civil rights scholarship, there's the idea of the long civil rights movement, and the idea that it's not just that you can't just essentialize civil rights to one line in one of Dr. King's speech, but you can't even essentialize it to Dr. King or that period in which he was active in work. You can, you know, you put him in the appropriate historical context, and you see the precedents for his work in earlier civil rights activism, like A. Philip Randolph, who was really active, not just in civil rights work, but also in labor unionist work. So there was a real connection between that in the 1930s and 40s. And then I think, as Stacy was saying, looking at, other activists within his period, and then even thereafter, to look at civil rights, not just as like one distinct period in our history, but as an ongoing movement before and after Dr. King's active work.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jill. I'll actually direct this to Jamil and Ryan most specifically. There's a number of comments about sort of who invited him, sort of what was behind that, and just wanting to know a little bit more about sort of the impetus for the invitation to Dr. King at that time. So who sort of coordinated that within our community, and what was the why?
Well, thank you, Bukata. Well, the Wesley Foundation and the Centenary Methodist Church invited Dr. King. They had met him earlier at a conference in Miami. I guess Mankato Snowbirds going to go to conferences in Southern Florida, but they were very impressed with him and they decided to bring him here. You know, Mankato does have a long tradition of liberal thinking churches here. In conversation, though, with the pastor of Centenary today, and the importance of the tradition of this within their own church, she acknowledged that the church was in existence in the 1860s when Mankato's sort of historic crimes against the Native American community were committed, and that they viewed this at the time and possibly today too as a way to I guess atone isn't the right word, but also as a way to be able to say, look, we acknowledge our history in the past and that we did nothing. We did nothing to stop that situation. And for those of people that don't know, in 1862, we had the largest mass execution in U.S. history here. 38 plus 2 were hanged at the conclusion of the Dakota War. And this has been a long-standing historical problem in Mankato. How to recognize this, how to deal with it. I see that a lot of the comments in the chats are about this, and we definitely we needed to mention that in the movie, that this is part of the heritage of Mankato, that we are, that we have to acknowledge it as we move forward, right?
Yeah, so it was Wilbur D. Gross. He was a pastor at Centenary Methodist Church and worked with the foundation, the Wesley Foundation at MSU. And it took, there's a section in the film where you get to see their actual letters, their correspondence. And it took 3 years for Martin Luther King to clear his calendar up in order to come, but he came. And you know, Dr. Morris adds in the film that he was invited. And if he hadn't been invited, he would not have come here, because this is his world. He's going to places that invite him, that, you know, want to understand what it is that he is speaking about. And we had, at that time, you know, many, I think, good-hearted people in Mankato that wanted to understand an issue that was not in their backyard, from their perspective, right? But I also think it's important to remember that when he came here with bodyguards, right? Because this is the North in the Midwest and the North in the 1960s, and there's a lot of racism, and it runs the gamut, right? From being violent and in your face racism to sort of underhanded and structural, right? And just because people wanted to hear what he had to say doesn't mean that they understood it entirely. Doesn't mean that they started to implement things that spoke to it, right? But the thing that matters is that we now are speaking of that moment, right? And I think whatever the impact was when he came here, had a ripple effect in that, and that's why we're all here talking today. And I just wanted to say one quick thing about your other question about, you know, his misconceptions. There was a whole segment of this film that was about that, and we all had a lot of conversations about that. So I'm really glad we talked about it, and I think that there's a lot more that we can expand on that concept if we progress this project any further, because that also runs the gamut, you know, from the talking heads in the news to the senators, you know, killing these bills, and to people every day doing things that they might not even know are harmful. And that's important.
Let me just to conclude that real quick. The only thing we have documentary wise is that speech recording from KMSU. There's no pictures. There's no really press coverage.
There's a couple of newspaper clippings.
And that's fascinating because I'm sure there was a negative reaction to him as well. But we as historians can't document it because there's no documentation, but that lack of documentation in itself speaks volumes.
Very good. Yeah. No, so you spoke to a couple of things that were in the question and answer too. And so I do want to sort of just build quickly off of that. We'll open it up to a few of the panelists. But one question talks about, do you think we would have come this far in civil rights for African Americans if he didn't come to Mankato? And I'd like to expand that to if he didn't go to places like Mankato, right? That was not Chicago. That was not Memphis. That was not LA. That was not New York. Do you think we would have advanced this far if he had not been willing to go to some of these smaller communities, predominantly white communities, hostile communities, to advance what we know is equality for all of us, but in particular for African Americans? So just a few comments on the importance of him going to places like Mankato to advance equality for African Americans and thus for all Americans. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought Jamil was amazing in that he was able to dig up the correspondence between the Wesley Foundation and Martin Luther King. That was buried in an archive in Boston University where all of King's papers are. So when I was working with students and we were trying to do some research to develop the text for this historical marker, that was one of the big mysteries we had. Was like, we knew he came here to fundraise, but we could never figure out like how much money he actually made. And he only ended up making like $200 here in Mankato. That's all he was paid. And the numbers, like, just to give you some context here, his legal bills stemming from still like the Montgomery bus boycott, there were still lawsuits pending from that. He had $27,000 of lawsuits from that. He needed to raise money at the very time that he's speaking in Mankato. Students are leading something called the Albany movement down in Albany, Georgia. There's about 400 kids that have filled up the jails down there that he's trying to raise money to help them bail out. It's $100 for every kid to get bailed out of jail down in Albany. His annual salary at Montgomery as a preacher was like $4,200, and that made him the highest paid preacher in Montgomery. So, what he's doing at this time, it's really important. Like, he's giving something like 200 speeches a year. So he's averaging like 4 speeches a week. And most of those speeches are in the North, in the Midwest, in the West, out of the South. Like, all of those speeches are intended to fundraise money for the movement down in the South to help people who are getting evicted, losing their homes, losing their jobs, having insurance policies canceled on them, filling up the jails and needing bail money for that. So I think like, if he's not doing that work, the movement does. Like, it's an interesting hypothetical to play out there. It's a major contingency in history here.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Matt.
I'd like to add to that just by talking about the realities of legislation, which of course we're all real familiar with from our own day. And so in the 1960s, getting the support of white Northerners was so important to passing that civil rights legislation, because you had a group of, at that time, Southern Democrats who really controlled Congress in a lot of ways that were stopping any legislation using, among other tactics, the filibuster in order to stop civil rights progress. And so there were a lot of different things that helped get Northern whites to, contact their congressmen and contact their senators about passing this legislation. And one of those many things, again, could be these hundreds of speaking engagements that he was doing, not just in the big cities, but in the smaller places like Mankato.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jill. So go ahead, Dr. Morris, if you're going.
I did open my mouth. I want to say I'm a fan of Martin Luther King, but the movement was bigger than him. There were lots of people who were leading the movement all over the place, including many women. I think the women were the backbone of the civil rights movement from the churches. And so he's a symbol of that time, but I never want us to forget there were lots of people whose lives were taken away from them, who were jailed also, and who were striving to make this a better place for everyone, including many women who were supporting and playing leadership roles. So I think it would have still happened. I mean, and I don't want to take it out of context of what I said, but there were lots of leaders and lots of people who were committed and knew this was wrong.
Yeah, very good. So we have about 5 minutes left. And so with that, I want to sort of pose one last question. Stems from his sort of constant encouragement and really at the same time a critique of our country. And it was sort of in that phrasing of be true to what you said on paper, right? Be true to what you said on paper. And so I'd ask each of you, again, we have about, each person has about 45 to 60 seconds so that we don't go over our time as a panel. But what do you believe we need to continue to do here in Greater Mankato, right, for us to realize equity and equality and be true to what we said on paper? And so to start that out, I will start with Jill.
Well, we need to teach the history, and we need to teach it accurately, and we need to teach the heart. We need to make people uncomfortable, and we need to do the hard work.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Jill. I'll go to Dr. Brown.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Jill said, but also we need to reflect on who we are and understand how history has impacted us, and history has impacted how we embody who we are and what we do and how we function in life. And it's so important to do that continual critical reflection of our own existence in this society.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Brown. We'll go to Stacy.
I think they really said it all. I would think it's really, in addition to what Jill and Chris said, it's really remaining courageous and knowing that it's not going to be perfect, but that shouldn't be the reason that we sort of step away or don't do it. So I guess that's what I always think about, is just being courageous and continuing on, even when it feels really, really hard.
Thank you. Matt?
So it's a tough question. Yeah, I think Martin Luther King Day as a holiday is kind of starting to become a day of service for a lot of people, a lot of businesses. And I think it would be great if we could also add that it should be a day of reading too, that, you know, we should have people read the full I Have a Dream speech, not just the end, but the full thing, because the beginning is pretty radical. In addition to reading other civil rights leaders like Dr. Morris was just talking about, women are playing a huge role in this movement, and I think we should acknowledge that and read some of their work too. So that's my one idea.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Morris.
Yeah, I think it is courage. I think we need to be courage. We are being pushed back, and we need to have courage about saying, no, that's not even a possibility. We need not to be able, especially us in higher ed, should not be afraid of teaching critical race theory. We should not be afraid of using that term. We should not let people tell us what terms we can and cannot use. You know, and I've had many conversations about that. Nope, thank you, but don't care what you think. And it is important. And I would put that out to the K-12 people. I put it out to our higher ed people. Teach history. It is not just the history of the winners. There's also lots of other history that gives you a full picture of what made this country, I would say, great. But there are a lot of blemishes on our history, and we ought to look at all of that, the blemishes and the beauty of America.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Morris. Virtual round of applause for our panelists today. Deeply appreciate your insights, your courage to speak to things unapologetically. And I think that's what I would leave for those watching right now is it took tremendous courage, bravery even, as Dr. Berry mentioned in the film, for Dr. King to come to Mankato. I think we all must display similar bravery as we fight against the forces who, truthfully, to Dr. Morris's comment, want to push us backwards, want to say we can't teach or we shouldn't teach this really critical history from multiple perspectives that, yes, will be difficult, but is critical for us to move forward. And so, again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your words today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jamil.
Thank you, Bukata. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you all for participating in this movie project, as well as thank you in the audience, everybody, for joining us. We're actually going to conclude the program now. And before we go, though, I do want to show you the culmination of some of the work that was done before we started our movie here at West High School, particularly by Matt Moore and assisted by the community. If we can show the monument that will be unveiled. This is right over here, actually, right next to me. It's gigantic, and it was going to go into the ground today, but those of you that have heard of Minnesota understand that the ground is frozen here until about July. So it's going to be some time before we get this in the ground, but this monument will be is here now, and it will be unveiled in the near future at West High School so that we can all remember this legacy. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. And everybody, please really reflect on what this day means to our country. Thank you.